Kurt Busch bests his younger brother Kyle Busch in the final race on Atlanta Motor Speedway's old worn-out track surface. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove. It's been a weekend of frustrations, both on and off the racetrack in the NASCAR world, from the demolition derby that the truck race at Knoxville turned into, to all of the controversy this morning with nearly every Cup Series driver speaking out against SMI's decision to reconfigure Atlanta. It was kind of nice and refreshing to see a fan favorite, can I say that now? In 2021, I think he's a fan favorite. To see fan favorite Kurt Busch beat his brother Kyle Busch in the closing laps at Atlanta to lock himself into the playoffs. We're going to talk about everything that happened here at Atlanta today, but first we have to thank today's sponsor. Out of the Groove is presented by Aspirin by Bayer, available at Walmart. Aspirin is for pain relief, stroke prevention, and heart health. I mentioned that Truck Series race at Knoxville. Ooh, watching that one, some aspirin may have come in handy. Be sure to talk to your doctor before starting an aspirin regimen. That's Aspirin by Bayer, available at Walmart. Today was up and down, pretty topsy-turvy if you ask me. It began when pretty much the entire NASCAR Cup Series field spoke to reporters and were asked about Atlanta's incoming changes. Earlier this week, SMI and Atlanta Motor Speedway announced that they will not only be repaving the track after this weekend, but they'll also be increasing the banking in the corners and narrowing the racing groove by a little bit in time for the next-gen cars debut at the track in 2022. As far as I can tell, every single driver who's been asked about these changes has said that they are not a fan of them, which doesn't come as much of a surprise. Remember 2 or 3 years ago, NASCAR drivers collectively begged and pleaded with SMI not to repave Atlanta back then because they love the old worn out, slipping and sliding, slick surface that the track presents currently, and SMI listened to them and didn't repave it for a couple more years. Until now, of course, SMI is kind of been put into a box. I mean, part of the track actually broke today. It's that old of a surface, so the track needs to be repaved. I don't think most people are arguing against that, even though I think if you ask most drivers, they'd still kind of like to see the old surface remain, but the track is in need of a repave. I don't think most people are arguing against that. But the reconfiguration is where the drama really comes in, because pretty much every driver who was asked today about the Atlanta reconfiguration said that they're not a fan of that one as well. But perhaps even worse, there seems to be growing dissent within the NASCAR garage. Many drivers feeling kind of disillusioned by current NASCAR leadership. Multiple drivers saying they don't feel listened to, that NASCAR executives are kind of out in a room by themselves doing what they believe is best without consulting those on the ground or those who have, years or in some cases decades of racing experience. Ultimately, it seems like many NASCAR drivers are frustrated by a lack of communication from NASCAR higher-ups. This is what Denny Hamlin told Bob Pockrass.
It's just, man, the disconnect right now between all the parties, NASCAR, the tracks, and the drivers, it's tough right now. It's not in a good place. The thing is, the drivers, we just tell us the agenda. Do you want speedway racing here? Okay, we don't like it, but here's what you need to do to get there. We'll help you accomplish that. Just tell us the goal.
Denny Hamlin kind of sounded like he's trying to extend an olive branch. If you just tell us exactly what you want, we, the drivers, will try to help get you there, even if it's not necessarily the kind of racing we're pushing for. But Hamlin was certainly not alone in those comments. I've seen clips from Kevin Harvick, from Joey Logano, from Brad Keselowski, from Kyle Larson in recent days, echoing similar concerns and sentiments. And so here's all I have to say. I know we're talking about this before we get to the race itself, but this is all themed around Atlanta Motor Speedway. It's a long day. But here's all I'm gonna say. This week has been a pretty awful PR week for NASCAR, a sanctioning body that cares deeply about how it's perceived by the public. They really care and worry deeply about their image. And this week, their image has taken a massive hit, whether it's the next gen, safety rumors, whether it's all these comments about Atlanta Motor Speedway from drivers saying that they're just not even being consulted, not even being considered when these changes are announced. Here's the thing. NASCAR fans are always going to trust and care more about what drivers are saying as opposed to anything a NASCAR official or NASCAR executive says. If NASCAR President Steve Phelps comes out and says one thing, and then Brad Keselowski, not a fan favorite by any means, comes out and says something completely different, fans more often than not are going to side with whatever Brad Keselowski says. He's the star. Nobody's paying to see Steve Phelps do his job. Fans, no matter what, are always going to put more stock into what the competitors are saying about the product. They're never going to give as much interest to what the sanctioning body is saying. And so NASCAR should know this, because by not involving these drivers in the conversations at least, they've opened themselves up to this kind of criticism. Because now all these drivers are coming out saying, yeah, we're not even being talked to. They don't seem to care what we have to say. And that's a terrible PR look for NASCAR. NASCAR. And I'm focusing on the PR. I know there's real serious questions and concerns behind the scenes about the next gen car, about the future schedules and things like that. But right now, this week, it's really all PR. Until we actually see the next gen car on track, we see next year's schedule come to fruition. It's all PR until we actually get to those events and their specific dates. It's all about PR. It's all about building up hype and anticipation for it. And this week, NASCAR took a pretty serious hit in that department because they just don't seem to get that the drivers are not only the celebrities, they're not only what sell tickets, they are also the most influential marketing people NASCAR has, period, when it comes to anything in their sport. They just don't seem to get that the drivers drive fan opinion. That they're not just driving race cars, they are driving the opinions of the fan base. And NASCAR, the sanctioning body, needs to get with that. They need to cue these drivers in, they need to involve these drivers in these discussions. I said this last week. They don't have to take every suggestion that Denny Hamlin or Kyle Busch make and actually make it reality, but they at least need to hear them out. They can ignore them later if they really want to, or only take bits and pieces of what they say, but they should at least hear them out, give them a platform, and it doesn't sound like NASCAR drivers are happy with the platform they currently have. I'm not going to sit here and say the drivers are always correct. I mean, case in point, NASCAR drivers, if you polled them, they loved the Atlanta Motor Speedway that exists today. They love that racetrack, the same track we've seen for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They love that racetrack, but the fans don't seem to care much for current Atlanta. Case in point, the stands today were abysmal. That looked like a summer COVID crowd from last year. The crowd today was extremely scarce. They cut to some wide shots and you could see around the track completely empty parking lots, tons of spaces and gaps in the campgrounds on the infield, plenty of gaps in the grandstands themselves. I don't want to try and put a number on it, but knowing that Atlanta, I think, currently seats around 60 or so thousand people, that might have been the smallest crowd at any NASCAR race this season. I'm just throwing that, I'm speculating on that. Atlanta got a second date this year. They've had one date a year for for a while now. They got a second date again, and the fans did not turn out for it here today. So that tells me that fans don't like current Atlanta, but drivers do. So I'm not saying the drivers are always correct, but going back to that earlier argument, the drivers should still be listened to so that they don't have fuel to go out into the media and talk about how they're not being listened to by NASCAR, not even being addressed, not even being approached by NASCAR. That's bad PR. NASCAR needs to be involving some of the drivers, at least some of the drivers, in some of these bigger decisions. Denny Hamlin said it best during one of the Twitter racing space earlier this week. He said that track should be in the business of promoting, not the business of competition. I think he's not wrong there. I hope this reconfiguration drums up some additional interest for Atlanta. I imagine Atlanta will have 2 dates again next season. I feel like they wouldn't be pouring all this money into the track if they weren't expecting 2 weekends next year. So I hope fans turn out in higher numbers next year. I thought today's race was pretty good. We've been really negative here this first half of the video, but let's get into the race itself because I have a lot of positive things to say about today's Quaker State 400. I forgot what race it was for a second there. The biggest story of the race today has to be Kurt Busch. He gets the win, his first win of the season, his first win since Las Vegas during the playoffs last fall. Kurt Busch locks himself into the playoffs. We've talked about Kurt on this show recently. Kurt Busch just a month and a half ago after the Coke 600 was well outside the top 20 in points. He's been on a tear. I believe 4 top 10s in his last 5 races coming into today. He'd vaulted himself into the top 16 in points coming into today, but he locks up. He wins stage 2, finished second in stage 1, and wins the race, just nearly missing out on maximum points today. That is uncharacteristic, not only of Kurt Busch, at least in the recent era, but of Chip Ganassi Racing, more importantly. Chip Ganassi Racing's been all over the news the last week or so. They're selling their team to Trackhouse at the end of this season. Chip Ganassi is bowing out of NASCAR completely. What does the team do the very next week? They come out and give Kurt Busch the best car by far he has had since joining Chip Ganassi Racing. He didn't just sneak up at the end and steal this win, the way he kind of has the last couple wins he's gotten for Chip Ganassi. No, he dominated. I mean, yes, he and Kyle Busch had a pretty epic back and forth battle in the closing stretch, but Kurt Busch had probably the best car from green flag to checkered flag today, and I don't think we can say that about Kurt Busch, any car he's driven for any team in years. Like, you might have to go back to Penske era, I don't know. When Kurt Busch won that race at Las Vegas last year to jump into the round of 8 of the playoffs, it was a cool story, but nobody really had Kurt Busch as a championship 4 threat, or it's definitely not a championship threat, even that late in the season. This year, this one's coming in July. We still have, almost 2 months, about a month and a half until the playoffs start. Kurt Busch and Chevrolet, I mean, they're fast. Chevy's been fast all season long. Kurt Busch is in a contract year. Dale Jr. said during the broadcast that he believes Kurt already has a deal lined up for next season, but Kurt Busch said during his post-race interview that he's still not sure. I mean, maybe he's just playing it up for the cameras, trying to be quiet about it, but he said that he's still not sure what he's doing next year. So still in a contract year. He's trying to run really, really hard. He's trying to maximize his value. I mean, I'm not picking Kurt Busch to make the championship 4 or anything like that, but we're seeing more speed from that team this year than we did most of last season. So keep that in mind. What a performance from Kurt Busch today, showing that he still has it. He beat his younger brother Kyle Busch with some help from Ross Chastain. Now, Kurt Busch, during his post-race interview, as well as when he crossed the finish line over the radio, shouting, "Yeah, thanks Chastain, that's teamwork right there." Kurt Busch acknowledged that Ross Chastain, who was one of the last cars on the lead lap at the time, helped him get by Kyle there in the closing laps. He kind of took Kyle Busch's lane away, which with this package at this track, that dirty air certainly slowed Kyle Busch down quite a bit. That got Kurt side by side with him, and Kurt, had the better car. So once he had that slight edge of position, he was able to clear Kyle Busch without too much trouble. So Ross Chastain certainly helped. Kyle Busch was not pleased with Ross Chastain after the race, saying during his post-race interview that just shows the kind of driver he is. And he said it with a very straight, very solemn face. In recent years when Kurt Busch wins a race, even when Kyle finishes second, as has happened, at Kentucky a couple years ago, Kyle still seems kind of like, I'm happy for Kurt. None of that today. Oh no, Kyle looked mad that he lost this race. I hadn't seen that out of Kyle, especially not for a Kurt Busch win in a long. Still a really impressive day for Kyle Busch. Martin Truex Jr. had to start at the rear today, and then he got sent back close to the rear after a bad pit stop midway through the race. He drove all the way up to third still. He probably had something for the leaders, but he just never had the track position to actually duke it out with them. And then we look at Alex Bowman, the only Hendrick Motorsports car in the top 5. Ryan Blaney gets a solid top 5 for Team Penske, the winner here from a few months ago. Good run for him. Tyler Reddick, how about that? He ran inside the top 5, top 10 all day long. Great run, great points day for Reddick. Chase Elliott gets a top 10 at his home track. Solid day. Christopher Bell is there as well. But again, focusing on Hendrick Motorsports, you don't see Kyle Larson anywhere near the front. He probably would have finished top 5 today until a late race speeding penalty hindered those efforts. But Hendrick Motorsports across the board was not that fast today. They were still pretty good today. I mean, Alex Bowman certainly had top 5, maybe top 3 speed at his best, but this was not the Hendrick Motorsports we have become accustomed to seeing in 2021. Worth noting, this is also the first mile-and-a-half race since rumors came out a few weeks ago that NASCAR had found something about Hendrick, specifically in the front ends, that they didn't really like. It didn't seem to hinder Hendrick at Pocono. I mean, Kyle Larson dominated that first race, and then Alex Bowman swooped in to get the victory, so it didn't hurt them too bad at Pocono. Road America, Chase Elliott still got the win, but going back to a mile-and-a-half, a very aero-sensitive racetrack like this, you could see that the Hendrick cars were not nearly as dominant as they have been at these types of tracks up to this point. So I think it's safe to say that NASCAR's crackdown on Hendrick affected them today. I think that was easily the #1 contributing factor today. Whatever it was that they were doing that was maybe skirting the edge that NASCAR began to get suspicious of, whatever that was, whatever NASCAR took away from them, that I believe is what affected them today. There's no other way to explain the entire organization being like a full 10th or 2 off the pace from what they've been at these tracks all season long. I mean, Kyle Larson led like 270 laps here just a couple months ago. He led 0 laps today. That doesn't happen in just 3 or 4 months unless NASCAR comes in and says, hey, stop doing that little suspicious thing we don't like. That's what contributed to their lesser performance today. Still decent. I mean, Bowman in the top 5, Chase Elliott not too far back. Larson probably would have gotten a top 5 today. Still not terrible, but worse than they were the rest of this season. The question now is, can they pick things back up in time for the playoffs? Because I think most people have at least a couple Hendrick cars making some noise deep in the playoffs this season. Rest of your top finishers right here. Kevin Harvick, one of his favorite tracks, he struggled to find the handle today. Still comes home 11th. Not terrible, all things considered, but there you have it. Those are your top finishers. Only one big on-track incident today, and it took place pretty early in this race, like lap 30 or so, 32. After a restart, Cody Ware was on the inside of 4 wide and got loose up into, I think he got into Anthony Alfredo, who got up into Ricky Stenhouse, who collected Daniel Suarez. Both Stenhouse and Suarez sustained heavy damage, catastrophic for Suarez especially given that he DNF'd 2 laps into last week's race at Road America with a transmission issue. Or he didn't DNF, he came back out, but finished many laps down. So 2 35th place or worst finishes in a row for Daniel Suarez has put him in must-win territory. He was already pretty much in must-win playoff territory, but man, Trackhouse had a lot of good momentum going for him. not so much these last couple of weeks. But those were your top finishers. Quick look at the playoff bubble. Kurt Busch with the win today locks himself into the playoffs effectively. Now, that playoff cut line, as you can see, is massive. Chris Buescher is 96 points behind Tyler Reddick. That's ridiculous. You know, unless we get a surprise winner like Matt DiBenedetto, Ross Chastain, or someone further back in points, I don't see any way any of these guys point their way in. You know, if a guy like Chastain were to win, then the battle between Reddick and Austin Dillon maybe for that last spot would become obviously a lot more closer than the current playoff cut battle. But boy, the playoffs, they've been pretty interesting. The cut line's been pretty interesting this year. That wasn't until Kurt Busch won today. He kind of blew that up. So we'll see what develops. Still many races to go. And of course you have Daytona at the very end of the regular season. Easily could lend itself to a surprise winner. So keep an eye out for that. To wrap things up, let's put this race on the Groovy Gauge. In a lot of ways, this race was extremely similar to the race here in March. It ended with two guys seconds ahead of the field battling it out. Lap traffic came into play. Back in March, it was Joey Logano maybe slowing Larson down a little bit to allow his teammate Blaney to catch him. This week, it was obviously Chastain getting in Kyle Busch's way to help Kurt Busch. So very, very similar from March's race to today's race, at least as far as the finish is concerned. This was a pretty decent race though, overall. Nothing to write home about. I think the finish was pretty exciting. People will be talking about the finish, I think, several years from now, but the race itself was kind of just going through the motions. Solid. I feel like for the final race with the old worn out Atlanta surface, it did pretty well. I don't think Atlanta has consistently been at its best for at least several years now. Again, I'm not against them repaving it. I think the reconfiguration is a risky move, especially given all the unknowns of the next gen car, but the repave I think is warranted. But for its final race on the worn out surface, even with that half-hour red flag for the track literally breaking, it's that old, I thought we saw a pretty good race today. I'm gonna give it a 70% on the Groovy Gauge. I was probably tracking in the high 50s, low 60s until we saw Kurt Busch close in on Kyle. Yeah, he had some help from Chastain, but once we saw that battle really heat up in the final 20 laps or so, and we even saw Kyle Busch mount a charge at the very end, and he actually got a nose out ahead of Chastain at one point, but lost the momentum on the outside. That finish definitely picked this score up a good 5, 10, 12 points in my book. So I'm giving it a 70%. Let me know what you guys would score this year's Atlanta Quaker State 400. Is it always the Quaker State 400? Isn't that the Quaker State 400? That used to be the Kentucky race, right? Has there been another Quaker State 400 at Atlanta? Either way, what'd you make of this weekend's race? Let me know down in the comments below. I feel like I was really negative in this episode, especially the first half of this episode, but I do feel like it's stuff that needs to be said. The drivers are saying it. I can't just sit here and ignore it. And I'm certainly not going to call NASCAR drivers wrong when they're voicing their opinions, especially not when pretty much every driver is voicing the same opinion. I'm not going to sit here and try to call them out and say that, oh, they're lying. NASCAR has never done a wrong thing in their life. But I just want to make sure NASCAR understands that the drivers drive fan opinions, like I said earlier. And if you have every driver in the sport saying that SMI is making a huge mistake, if you have every driver in the sport saying, hey, we're a little concerned about the next gen car and some of the recent tests, if you're not even listening to them, if you're not even inviting some of these drivers into meetings, whatever negative things they say to the press, that's on you at that point. That is on NASCAR. So I hope they own up to it, and I hope they change their behind the scenes processes fairly soon, fairly quickly, so they can at least avoid the negative PR, and hopefully at the same time can make the product better. Because that's what we all ultimately want to see at the end of the day, is a better racing product. Anyway, y'all, that's all I've got for today's episode. Thank you all for sticking it out with me. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. And as always, a huge thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters. I couldn't do this show without your tremendous support each and every month. I'm back home in my studio this week, and I'll be here for at least a few more weeks, but before long, I'll be announcing my end of the summer and early fall travel plans. Got a few other races on my schedule currently that I will be sharing with you shortly. Have some exciting plans there. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you later this week. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend.